The gunshot echoed across the mesa like thunder, and Samuel Hartwell knew his 20 years of solitude were about to end. Not because of the bullet that had just shattered his cabin window, but because of the trembling voice that followed it through the desert wind. "Please, mister," came the desperate cry from somewhere beyond his porch. "Don't shoot. I got a boy with me." Samuel lowered his Winchester and stepped into the doorway, his weathered face etched with suspicion. In 2 decades of living alone on this God-forsaken patch of New Mexico territory, he'd learned that visitors meant trouble. The last one had tried to rob him. The one before that had brought news of his brother's death in a mining accident. But as his eyes adjusted to the harsh afternoon sun, what he saw made his calloused hands tighten around the rifle's stock. A woman, maybe 30 years old, stood 50 yards from his cabin with her hands raised. Her dress was torn and dusty, her dark hair wild from riding hard. Behind her, partially hidden by a scraggly mesquite bush, a boy of perhaps 10 or 11 peered out with eyes wide as silver dollars. The woman's horse lay dead in the dirt, foam still fresh around its muzzle. They'd ridden the animal to death getting here. "Water," the woman gasped, swaying on her feet. "Please, sir, we haven't had water in 2 days." Samuel's first instinct was to turn them away. 20 years ago, he'd made a promise to himself and to the graves he'd left behind in Kansas. No more people, no more attachments, no more chances for his heart to be torn apart again. But the boy's hollow cheeks and the way he clutched at his mother's skirts spoke to something deeper than Samuel's carefully constructed walls. "You running from something?" Samuel called out, not lowering his weapon. The woman's eyes darted toward the eastern horizon where dust clouds suggested pursuing riders. "My husband," she said, her voice breaking. "He ain't the boy's father, and he's not a good man. We had to leave." Samuel studied them for a long moment. The woman's bruises were visible even from this distance, purple and yellow marks around her wrists and neck. The boy was thin, too thin, and had the haunted look of a child who'd seen too much violence. Against his better judgment, Samuel felt the familiar tug of conscience that had once made him a decent man. "Well, don't just stand there bleeding in my dirt," he growled, finally lowering the rifle. "Get inside before those riders catch up." The woman nearly collapsed with relief. She gathered the boy close and hurried toward the cabin, glancing back nervously at the dust clouds that were growing larger by the minute. Samuel counted at least 4 riders, maybe 5, and they were closing fast. Inside the modest cabin, Samuel poured water from a ceramic pitcher into a tin cup, watching as the woman helped the boy drink slowly. She was careful not to let him gulp it down too fast, the practiced motion of a mother who'd dealt with desperate thirst before. The boy's eyes never left Samuel's face, studying him with an intensity that made the old cowboy uncomfortable. "Name's Maria Santos," the woman said quietly. "This is my son, Diego." Samuel nodded curtly but didn't offer his own name. He moved to the window and peered through the gap in the curtains. The riders were close enough now that he could make out their faces. Hard men, the kind who made their living with violence. The leader was a big man with a black beard and a scar across his left cheek. He sat his horse like a man accustomed to taking what he wanted. "That him?" Samuel asked, nodding toward the approaching riders. Maria's face went pale. "That's him. Wade Carver. He married me 3 years ago when Diego's father died. I thought he'd be good to us. I was wrong." The pounding of hooves stopped outside the cabin, followed by the creak of leather and the jingle of spurs. Samuel grabbed his gun belt from its peg and strapped it around his waist, the familiar weight of the Colt .45 settling against his hip like an old friend. It had been months since he'd worn it, but his hands remembered the motion perfectly. "Samuel Hartwell!" Wade Carver's voice boomed across the yard. "I know you're in there, old man. Send out my wife and boy, and we'll be on our way." Samuel glanced at Maria, who was clutching Diego so tightly the boy could barely breathe. "He know you're here." "We left tracks," she whispered. "Couldn't help it with the horse dying." Samuel moved back to the window. 5 men, all armed, all looking eager for a fight. 20 years ago, he might have welcomed the challenge. Now he just felt tired. But looking at the terror in Diego's eyes, he found himself remembering another boy, another time, another promise he'd failed to keep. "You got any claim on these people, Carver?" Samuel called out. Carver's laughter was harsh and ugly. She's my wife, Hartwell. The boy's my stepson. They belong to me. That's where you're wrong, Samuel said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd faced down plenty of bullies in his time. Nobody belongs to nobody. They're under my protection now. The sound of guns being cocked outside made Maria whimper. Diego pulled free from his mother's grip and walked to Samuel's side, his small hand reaching up to touch the old cowboy's arm. Are you really going to protect us, mister? The boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Samuel looked down at Diego and saw something that made his chest tighten painfully. The boy's eyes held the same desperate hope that his own sons had carried, right up until the fever took him 23 years ago. The same trust that his wife had shown him before the consumption stole her breath away. The same faith that had died with them both, leaving Samuel to wander the frontier like a ghost. Yeah, boy, Samuel said quietly. I reckon I am. The first shot shattered the remaining window glass, sending splinters across the cabin floor. Samuel pushed Diego behind the heavy oak table and motioned for Maria to join him. Stay down, he ordered, drawing his pistol. Don't move until I tell you. Samuel had built his cabin with defense in mind. The walls were thick adobe, the windows small and high, and he'd positioned it on a slight rise that gave him a clear view of the approaches. He'd also dug a tunnel that led from the root cellar to a hidden exit near the well, though he'd never expected to need it. Hartwell, Carver shouted. This is your last chance. Send them out or we're coming in. Samuel's response was a bullet that sent Carver's hat spinning into the dust. The big man dove for cover behind a water trough, cursing loud enough to be heard in the next county. His men spread out, taking positions behind rocks and scrub brush. For the next hour, the cabin was under siege. Bullets thudded into the adobe walls and whistled through the broken windows. Samuel moved from position to position, returning fire when he had a clear shot. He was a good marksman, always had been, and his bullets found their mark twice. One of Carver's men limped away with a shattered shoulder, and another wouldn't be using his gun hand for a while. But Samuel was outnumbered, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they found a way in. Worse, his ammunition was running low. He'd been living peacefully for so long that he'd grown careless about keeping a full supply of cartridges. During a lull in the shooting, Diego crawled over to where Samuel was reloading his rifle. Mister, the boy whispered, there's something I got to tell you. Samuel glanced at the boy, noting the serious expression on his young face. What is it, son? Wade ain't really my stepfather. He killed my real father and forced my mama to marry him. Said if she didn't, he'd kill me too. The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. He'd suspected there was more to the story, but hearing it confirmed made his blood run cold. He looked across the cabin at Maria, who was watching them with tears streaming down her face. Is that true? Samuel asked. Maria nodded. Diego's father was a good man, a sheriff in a small town called Esperanza. Wade and his gang robbed the bank there, and Miguel tried to stop them. Wade shot him down in the street like a dog. Then he came to our house and told me I had a choice. Marry him or watch my son die. Samuel felt something breaking open inside his chest, something he'd kept carefully locked away for 20 years. The fury that rose in him was clean and pure, untainted by the bitterness that had sustained him through 2 decades of isolation. This wasn't just about protecting strangers anymore. This was about justice. Diego, Samuel said, his voice steady as granite, I want you to listen to me carefully. You see that trap door over there by the stove? It leads to a tunnel that comes out near the well. If things go bad, you take your mama and you run. You keep running until you reach the town of Las Cruces, about 20 miles south. You tell Sheriff Morrison that Samuel Hartwell sent you, and you tell him what happened to your father. What about you? Diego asked. Samuel checked his rifle one more time. I'll be right behind you, son. I promise. But even as he said the words, Samuel knew he was lying. He had maybe a dozen bullets left, and Carver still had 4 men with him. The only way Maria and Diego were getting out of this alive was if someone held the cabin long enough for them to escape. The attack came just as the sun was setting, turning the sky the color of fresh blood. Carver and his men rushed the cabin from 3 sides, screaming like banshees and firing as they came. Samuel met them with steady, accurate fire, dropping one man before he reached the porch and wounding another. But they kept coming. Samuel heard the sound of boots on his roof and knew they were trying to come down the chimney. He fired up the flue, eliciting a scream and the sound of a body hitting the ground outside. But the distraction cost him. Carver smashed through the front door, his gun already drawn. "End of the line, old man," Carver snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. The shot echoed through the cabin, but it wasn't Carver who fired. Diego stood beside the overturned table, Samuel's spare pistol smoking in his small hands. The bullet had taken Carver in the chest, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the wall. "Nobody hurts my family," the boy said, his voice shaking but determined. Samuel stared at Diego in amazement. The boy had saved his life, but more than that, he'd called them family. In 20 years of self-imposed exile, Samuel had forgotten what that word meant. Now it hit him like a revelation. The remaining gunmen outside had heard the shot and were calling for their leader. When no answer came, they began to retreat, apparently deciding that whatever Carver was paying them wasn't worth dying for. Samuel watched from the window as they mounted their horses and rode away into the gathering darkness. Maria rushed to Diego, checking him for injuries and praising his courage. But the boy's attention was focused entirely on Samuel, who was slumped against the wall with a spreading red stain on his shirt. He'd taken a bullet during the final assault and hadn't even realized it. "You're hurt," Diego said, his voice filled with concern. Samuel looked down at the wound and shrugged. "I've had worse. Your mama know anything about doctoring?" For the next hour, Maria worked to clean and bandage Samuel's wound while Diego helped by fetching water and holding the lamp. The bullet had passed through cleanly, missing anything vital, but Samuel had lost a fair amount of blood. As Maria worked, she talked softly about her life before Wade Carver, about her husband Miguel, and the dreams they'd shared for their son's future. "Miguel always said that good men were rare as hen's teeth," she said, tying off the bandage. "But when you found one, you held on tight." Samuel didn't know how to respond to that. He'd stopped thinking of himself as a good man long ago. After his family died, he'd done things he wasn't proud of. He'd ridden with men who lived by the gun and died by it. He'd taken money for jobs that decent folk wouldn't touch. It was only when he'd finally had enough of the violence and bloodshed that he'd retreated to this isolated cabin, trying to make peace with his demons. But looking at Diego, who was carefully cleaning Samuel's rifle with the seriousness of a much older boy, Samuel began to wonder if maybe it wasn't too late for redemption. Maybe 20 years of solitude had been enough the penance. Maybe it was time to remember what it felt like to be part of a family again. "Diego," Samuel said softly, "come here, son." The boy approached, his eyes bright with curiosity. Samuel reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It showed a woman and a young boy, both smiling at the camera. The woman had kind eyes and a gentle smile. The boy looked to be about Diego's age. "This was my family," Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion. "My wife, Ellen, and my son, Thomas. They died of fever 23 years ago, and I blame myself for not being able to save them. I've been running from that guilt ever since." Diego studied the photograph carefully. "They look like good people." "They were the best people I ever knew," Samuel said. "And I think they'd want me to help you and your mama, if you'll have me." Maria knelt beside them, her hand resting on Samuel's shoulder. "We don't have anywhere else to go," she said quietly. "Wade's gang might come back or send word to others. We can't go back to any of the places we've been." Samuel nodded. "Then we'll make a new place, all of us together." Over the following weeks, something beautiful began to grow in the harsh desert landscape around Samuel's cabin. Maria proved to be an excellent cook and an even better companion. She had a way of filling the silence that had been Samuel's only friend for so long, but she also understood when he needed quiet. She tended a small garden behind the cabin, coaxing vegetables from the stubborn soil with patience and determination. Diego threw himself into learning everything Samuel could teach him. The boy was hungry for knowledge, soaking up lessons about riding, shooting, tracking, and survival with an eagerness that reminded Samuel of his own son. But Diego also brought something new to Samuel's life: laughter. The boy had a quick wit and a mischievous streak that often caught the old cowboy off guard. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Diego surprised Samuel with a question that cut straight to the heart. Samuel, the boy said, would it be okay if I called you Pa? Samuel felt his throat tighten. He'd never expected to hear that word again, never thought he'd want to. But coming from Diego, it felt like a gift he didn't deserve but desperately wanted. I'd be honored, son, Samuel said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maria reached over and took Samuel's hand, her fingers intertwining with his calloused ones. Miguel used to say that family isn't just about blood, she said softly. It's about choosing to love someone and stick by them no matter what. As the stars began to appear in the vast New Mexico sky, Samuel realized that his 20 years of exile were truly over. He'd spent so long believing that he was meant to be alone, that loving someone only led to loss and pain. But Maria and Diego had shown him that the risk of loss was worth taking for the joy of having something to live for. The months that followed weren't easy. Word of Wade Carver's death had spread, and occasionally rough men would ride up to the cabin asking questions. Samuel dealt with them firmly but fairly, making it clear that his family was under his protection. Most moved on without trouble. The few who didn't learned why Samuel Hartwell had survived 20 years alone in dangerous country. Diego grew stronger and more confident with each passing day. Samuel taught him to read the signs of the desert, to track animals and find water, to handle a gun safely and use it only when necessary. But more importantly, he taught him about honor, about standing up for what was right, and about the responsibility that came with strength. Maria bloomed in the safety and stability of their new life. Her bruises faded, her smile returned, and she began to talk about the future, with hope instead of fear. She and Samuel were married by a circuit preacher who happened through the area, with Diego proudly serving as best man. But it was on a warm spring evening, almost a year after that first desperate encounter, that Samuel truly understood how much his life had changed. He was teaching Diego to whittle on the front porch when a group of riders approached. Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Diego placed a small hand on his arm. It's okay, Pa, the boy said. I know them. The riders were led by a middle-aged man wearing a sheriff's badge. Behind him rode several townspeople, including a woman who looked remarkably like Maria. As they drew closer, Samuel could see that the woman was crying. Miguel! Maria gasped, running toward the riders. But it wasn't Miguel. It was Maria's sister, Elena, whom she hadn't seen in over 3 years. The sheriff introduced himself as John Morrison from Las Cruces, the same man Samuel had told Diego to seek out if things went badly. But instead of bringing trouble, Morrison brought news that changed everything. Wade Carver's gang has been broken up, Morrison explained as they gathered in the cabin. We found evidence in their hideout that proves they killed at least 6 lawmen across the territory, including Sheriff Miguel Santos. There's a reward for information leading to their capture, and according to the witnesses in town, you folks are entitled to it. The reward was substantial, enough to buy a real ranch with good water and fertile soil. But more importantly, it meant vindication for Miguel's memory and safety for Maria and Diego. Elena, who had been searching for her sister for months, wept as she embraced Maria and Diego. I thought you were dead, she sobbed, when we heard about Miguel and then you disappeared. But it was Diego who provided the moment that Samuel would remember for the rest of his life. As the family reunion continued around them, the boy pulled Samuel aside. Pa, Diego said seriously, Elena wants us to come live near her family in Colorado. She says it would be safer, and I'd have cousins to play with. Samuel felt his heart sink. Of course they should go. Diego deserved to grow up around family, to have friends his own age, to attend a real school. Maria deserved to be near her sister and to live in a place where she wouldn't have to worry about her past catching up with her. That sounds like a fine idea, son, Samuel said, trying to keep the sadness out of his voice. You and your mama deserve better than this old desert rat can give you. Diego frowned, his young face creasing with confusion. But Pa, don't you understand? We want you to come with us. We're a family now. Families stick together. The simple truth of it hit Samuel like a physical blow. He'd been so accustomed to loss, so prepared for abandonment, that he'd forgotten the most basic rule of love. When it's real, it endures. You sure about that, son? Samuel asked, his voice rough with emotion. Diego grinned, the expression transforming his serious young face. I'm sure, Pa. Besides, somebody's got to teach all those Colorado boys how to shoot straight. 6 months later, Samuel stood on the porch of a new cabin, this one built on a green hillside in Colorado with a view of snow-capped mountains. The cabin was larger than his desert home, with room for a growing family and occasional visitors. Elena lived just over the next hill with her husband and children, and the sound of young voices often filled the air around the Hartwell place. Diego had started school in the nearby town and was making friends quickly, though he still preferred spending his free time with Samuel, learning the skills that would make him a man. Maria had taken over the local church's charitable work, helping other women who found themselves in situations similar to what she'd faced with Wade Carver. And Samuel? Samuel had discovered that love, real love, didn't end with death. It grew and changed and found new expressions. The love he'd felt for Ellen and Thomas hadn't been replaced by what he felt for Maria and Diego. Instead, it had expanded, as if his heart had finally remembered how to be whole. On this particular evening, as he watched Diego teaching his young cousins how to whittle, Samuel felt a presence beside him. He turned to see Maria approaching with a letter in her hand and a smile on her face. "News from town," she said, settling beside him on the porch swing he'd built. "The territorial governor wants to offer you a position as a deputy marshal. Says the territory needs men with your experience and reputation." Samuel chuckled. "My reputation? That's a polite way of putting it." "It's not just your reputation with a gun," Maria said seriously. "It's your reputation as a man who stands up for what's right, who protects those who can't protect themselves." Samuel considered the offer. It would mean travel, danger, time away from his family, but it would also mean using his skills for something worthwhile, making the frontier a little safer for families like his own. "What do you think?" he asked Maria. "I think," she said, leaning against his shoulder, "that Diego would be proud to tell people his father is a lawman, and I think you'd be good at it." That night, after Diego had gone to bed and Maria was reading by the fire, Samuel stepped outside to look at the stars. They seemed different here in Colorado, brighter somehow, as if the thin mountain air brought them closer to earth. He thought about the man he'd been 20 years ago, bitter and broken and convinced that he was meant to be alone. That man would never have believed he could find this kind of happiness again. "Pa?" Diego's voice came from the doorway behind him. "Can't sleep?" Samuel turned to see the boy silhouetted against the warm light spilling from the cabin. "Just thinking, son. What about you?" Diego joined him at the porch railing, mimicking Samuel's pose perfectly. "I was thinking too, about how different things might have been if we hadn't found you that day." Samuel nodded. "I think about that sometimes too." "I'm glad we found you," Diego said simply. "I'm glad you decided to help us." Samuel put his arm around the boy's shoulders, feeling the solid weight of him, the reality of this second chance he'd been given. "I'm glad too, son. More glad than you could ever know." As they stood there together, father and son by choice rather than blood, Samuel understood something that had eluded him for 20 years. Home wasn't a place you retreated to when the world became too much to bear. Home was the people you chose to stand with, the ones you protected and who protected you in return. It was love in action, courage in the face of fear, and the daily decision to keep trying even when everything seemed hopeless. The wind carried the scent of pine and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the valley below. Somewhere in the house, Maria was humming softly as she worked, and beside him, Diego was growing into the kind of man who would make the frontier a better place for the next generation. Samuel Hartwell had lived alone for 20 years, but he would never be alone again, and for the first time since he'd lost his first family, he was truly at peace.